I think where you land is that Ukraine keeps the territory that it has right now. It doesn't give up more territory. Russia occupies where it is right now. Ukraine gets a path to the European Union economically. I don't think it will become a member of NATO, a process that would take years anyway, but I think it gets almost an association with NATO, which includes Western arms, and it includes an assurance from individual states who are in NATO that they will come to Ukraine's defense if they're attacked again.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Professor Scott Lucas on the show. We've spoken about this upcoming meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, officially taking place this Friday, August 15th in Alaska. So we speak all about that, the likelihood this will go ahead, why it is in Alaska in the US, as opposed to Saudi Arabia, where we originally thought any sort of face-to-face meeting between the two would take place there with the Crown Prince. So all that today. There is so much to discuss about this meeting and what we can get out of it or what we might not get out of it, and the fact that Ukraine still isn't invited to the table. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcast. Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
And a happy Monday to you, Maddie. What should we talk about?
And a happy Monday to you. We are a few days out from one of the biggest days of the year. You and I have spoken so much about this off camera, but last Friday, I want to get into the gist of what's happened. But last Friday, all eyes were basically on whether Donald Trump was going to mention this 10 to 12 day deadline that he had imposed on Vladimir Putin. Now, he didn't exactly mention it. He more pivoted and announced this summit between him and Vladimir Putin that would take place this coming Friday, August 15th. Look, now that the meeting is confirmed, but what is your response, Scott, I guess, to the lack of acknowledgement of this deadline? Or do you think that the fact that Donald Trump even got the meeting with Vladimir Putin is a success in its own right?
I think this deadline for the toughened sanctions that were going to go on Russia and its trading partners, including China and India, is linked to what then happened, which is the Kremlin offering the face-to-face to Trump in Alaska. Indeed, what happened is we had gotten to the point where the Kremlin was very much on the political defensive. And again, for context, if you walk this back 6 months ago, if we're talking in February, Russia has got the Trump administration at the table for direct talks. Ukraine's excluded. The Europeans are excluded. The Russians can come in and they can make their demands that they be allowed to seize for the long term more than 20% of Ukraine. Sanctions dropped. Ukraine kept weak and demilitarized. They misplayed their hand for reasons that we can go into. They misplayed it because they were too tough in their demands, and then they misplayed it because they upset Trump by attacking Ukraine civilians and attacking them again and again with the drones and the missiles. And Trump, who, he's unpredictable, he's chaotic, he's certainly no friend of Ukraine, but he wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And here the Russians were just simply killing. And when it got to the point, I think this is a serious story, because he repeats it. When it got to the point that Melania was telling him, look, the Russians just thumbed their nose at you by attacking a nursing home, then he announces this deadline. Now, the Russians know that this time Trump might be serious, or at the least that Trump may accept his own officials or Congress toughening the sanctions. So what do? They have one last card they can play. They've tried the phone calls with Trump. They've tried the direct talks with the Americans. Now they can give him the face-to-face with Putin. And that's why they did this.
Scott, are you not in the mindset that the only reason why Putin agreed to the meeting with Trump is to stall more time?
Oh, he's trying to get more time on the battlefield. We're not talking about negotiations, all right? So let's be very clear here. Russia is not negotiating, although it's a bit muddled because we're relying on Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, not exactly the most seasoned of diplomats, coming back from Moscow. It's that the Kremlin effectively said, okay. Look, we're not going to demand all of the two southern regions. Zaporizhia and Kherson. We'll just keep the parts that we already occupy. And we get Crimea. Oh, but in the east, not only do we get the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that we occupy, we get the rest of it that we don't occupy. Ukraine has to withdraw. So that was the Kremlin's concession. Give us more territory, right? And then on top of that, of course, they're going to say, and then we can lift the sanctions, and then Ukraine won't join NATO, and it won't get military aid from the West. Now that's not a negotiation. Now, one of two things happens here. The Kremlin rolled Trump, and all of a sudden, you and I find out late Friday that Trump appears alongside Vlad in that press conference in Alaska and goes, yes, Russia gets the east and the south of Ukraine. It's part of Greater Russia, peace in our time. And yes, that is a deliberate reference for history buffs. And Vladimir goes, thank you very much. And the Kremlin gets what it wants. Or Trump holds out, doesn't give the Russians what they want. We are left in limbo where this goes. And part of that limbo is going to be, do the Russians continue to reject a ceasefire, and do they continue to kill civilians on a daily basis?
I'm going to get into what both countries want, because I think it's important for you and I to remind the audience what is at stake, what's on the table here. Now, the question that I'm going to ask you, Scott, is basically how do both countries get what they want? And right now it seems like it might be impossible. But what I'm going to read out to you is basically, just so everyone understands, that the general consensus from Russia's side is that they want to keep that 20% of Ukrainian land that they've occupied, which includes Crimea, as you mentioned. They want written assurance that NATO will not expand to Ukraine. They want the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces, the withdrawal of Western sanctions, as you mentioned, and for the US to commit to basically not protecting Ukraine in the future. Now, that's, of course, a roundabout way of saying they don't want them to protect should they invade again. Now, of course, Ukraine, what do they want? They want the war and the invasion to end. They want the return of all hostages. They want their own sovereign territory. They want accountability and justice, just to name a few. So is there a world in which do you think that each country get a bit of what they want, or it's either one or the other?
I mean, there's a landing point, Maddie, and it's been a landing point, I've said, for months. And it is this. You ceasefire, okay? And therefore, that has to be, and that's what Ukraine and Europe are saying to the Trump administration, and some Trump people agree with this. Look, before you talk about specific terms, you got to get a ceasefire. 30 days, 60 days, whatever. Then we talk about the terms, and I think the terms are this. Now, Ukraine will not say this openly, but I think if you look at what officials say to the media and what Ukraine has been saying to the Europeans, it is, look, we know we can't push Russia out of the areas that they occupy militarily. You know, the Russians are dug in to eastern Ukraine. They're dug into parts of the south. Ever since Ukraine's counteroffensive failed in 2023, that's where we've been. On the other hand, the Russians are not winning. The Russians are making only very, very slow progress in Donetsk. They've tried for more than a year, for example, to overrun the town of Pokrovsk. They've leveled it. They still can't get into it. They've been pushed back in Sumy on the border in northeast Ukraine, which they tried to get a buffer zone. So where do you go in what is effectively a stalemate there? You get back to a parallel of what, for me, and it's a rough parallel, what we had during the Cold War with West Germany and East Germany. That is, the West were not going to overrun East Germany and force the Soviets out. The Soviets, after they failed with the Berlin blockade in 1948, were not going to break West Germany. So what happened? East Germany remained in the Soviet sphere for the next 40 years. West Germany, however, moved from strength to strength. Economically becomes part of the European Economic Community, which eventually will become the European Union, and it joins NATO. I think where you land is that Ukraine keeps the territory that it has right now. It doesn't give up more territory. Russia occupies where it is right now. Ukraine gets a path to the European Union economically. I don't think it will become a member of NATO, a process that would take years anyway, but I think it gets almost an association with NATO, which includes Western arms, and it includes an assurance from individual states who are in NATO that they will come to Ukraine's defense if they're attacked again.
Okay, so they give up some sort of land, is what you're saying, but they, in order to do that, they have a written assurance that the US, NATO will protect them if they invade further.
I don't think you necessarily have to get it from NATO, and you're not going to get it from the Trump folks. I think you get it from European states. I think you get it from European states. Now, one other thing I should add to that: when I say Ukraine gives up territory and accepts the Russian occupation, they do not accept that these areas legally become part of Russia. They do not give up sovereignty, which again is a big sticking point because at times the Trump folks, or at least Trump himself, has wavered on the idea of, oh yeah, we'll recognize Russia's annexation. That's a no-go for Kyiv.
And the other day, Donald Trump, he said that he's openly suggested a territorial swap. So, Scott, I wonder, right now as you and I speak, Ukraine nor European leaders are at the table. I keep referring to a negotiating table, but I'm not quite sure if that's what we're going to call it because we don't know if a negotiation will take place. But as we speak right now, Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, nor European leaders will be at the meeting with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. My only thing is that I wonder how Donald Trump can represent Ukraine's best interests without a Ukrainian representative there. Otherwise, I just feel like we're back to square one. Isn't this what we've already been doing?
He doesn't represent Ukraine's interests there. But let's go step by step because you said something that's important here in terms of when he said territorial swap. And I'll just back up as to why that came about, because what territory is Russia going to give away in exchange for seizing part of Ukraine? What happened here is, and it goes back to the purported envoy and real estate developer Steve Witkoff when he was in the Kremlin. It appears that what Witkoff came back and told people is that, okay, in exchange for getting more territory in the east, Russia may withdraw from the areas that it occupies in the south, which includes Zaporizhia and Kherson. And this would include probably, the port city of Mariupol, which became the symbolic city that the Russians just leveled, killing tens of thousands of civilians back in 2022. But then somebody got it straight, and the Russians said, no, we're not going to withdraw from any part that we currently occupy in the south. But that's got confused, which is why Trump said territorial swap. So let's park that. Now we're into another area of confusion, which I think we can clear up here, which is, well, does Zelenskyy get an invitation to the party in Alaska? Look, there's only two ways that Zelenskyy winds up going to Alaska, neither of which flies, I think. One is that he gets invited out to Alaska to accept the ultimatum which is handed to him by Trump and by Putin, which is, here's the deal, take it, right? And it's going to be like, no, that ain't going to happen because, there's no way that Zelensky's going to sign away 20% of Ukraine. By the way, legally, he can't do that. You would have to have a referendum in Ukraine as well. But, that's the least of our worries at this point. The other way that Zelenskyy goes there is you talk about negotiations where Trump talks to Putin and then the Americans go and talk to Zelenskyy. But here's the problem. Putin doesn't recognize Zelenskyy as a legitimate president. He doesn't recognize the Zelenskyy government as a legitimate government. He doesn't recognize it, in other words, for the purposes of negotiations. So why does Zelenskyy go out there? I think what is happening, and this is what's more important to work on, is that the Zelenskyy and the Europeans, who have been here before, they were back here in the spring when you had the direct U.S.-Russia talks. They have been working on the Trump administration officials to say, look, nothing gets agreed in this meeting in Alaska. We're not going to consent to that. You can have your talks with Putin, but then you need to have further negotiations and bring us into the negotiations. And indeed, on Saturday, what was happening? After J.D. Vance, who's become an interesting figure in this for reasons I can explain, after J.D. Vance met the British Foreign Minister, David Lammy, then Lammy met with the Europeans in Kent, outside London, and they briefed, they debriefed. right? So what's happening here is that the Europeans and Ukraine are talking to Trump administration officials not to get Zelenskyy into Alaska, but so that there's no ultimatum that come out of that meeting, and we're set up for the further negotiations that follow.
So this meeting on what we're saying in this meeting on Friday, it can't be the final. It can't be the final decision making, because obviously what we're worried about, Scott, is that Donald Trump will be so eager to get a deal over the line, to get a peace deal, that he will agree to certain conditions on behalf of Ukraine, and it won't be the correct thing, such as the 20% of land, as you mentioned. And I wonder if that might be the situation that we've kind of been fearful. But also, I want to read out this quote from a Ukrainian militant who served for 3 years on the front line. He told Al Jazeera that there's going to be no miracles, no peace deal in a week, and Putin will try to make Trump believe that it is Ukraine that doesn't want peace.
No. No, that's right. And let's hand it over to another person as well who's removed from the front lines, who's the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who just spoke in the last hour to journalists. And what Tusk said, what I found, he said, I have hopes and concerns, both, because of the unpredictability of Donald Trump, right? I have hopes that something could come out of this, but I have concerns as well, which is, and that's pretty much, and Tusk has been involved in the European leaders along Macron, Maloney, Starmer, and Meretz this week. So that, I think, is the starting point here. I think your Ukrainian source, though, is key here, because what it's saying here is it's not that there's going to be an agreement that comes out of this, but Russia's going to try to change the narrative. Now, remember, what was the immediate reason why the Russians wanted the meeting? No toughened sanctions. So that's what they get out of this immediately, is that Trump backs off the talk of toughened sanctions. Then what do they want? They want the space to be able to continue with the attacks on the battlefield and from the air without pressure for a ceasefire. Because again, I'll repeat, this is the broad context here. I don't like making predictions, but I think if you look at the Russian economy, if you look at what they're having to throw on the battlefield, maybe a 6 to 12 month window for Putin to try to win this militarily. But to do that, he's got to have the space to go all out on the ground and all out with the aerial campaign. And he doesn't want Trump getting in the way of that. So this is more of a meeting not to agree anything. It's to push Trump back so he doesn't stand in the way of the Russians.
What I wonder what will happen, Scott, is that there will be no sort of agreement, no sort of outcome. We'll be back to the 4 discussions that Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, has had with the Kremlin, or the very few peace negotiations, whether they're in Turkey or not, where neither side can agree because, of course, the concessions contradict each other. So what I wonder is, if Donald Trump walks away from this meeting on Friday and they are basically back to square one, there's been no resolution, is it then that he has to invoke these tariffs and there cannot be an open negotiation again?
Yeah, I'd watch a couple things, Maddie. One other thing that the Kremlin wants from this meeting this week is they want to try to get the Americans to close off what has become the military pipeline for weapons. In recent weeks, what we've seen, and this is what Ukraine and Europe have been working on with the U.S. on for months, is the Americans sell the weapons, and this includes air defense systems, it includes rockets, it includes anti-tank missiles, it may include support for warplanes. You sell that to the Europeans then give that to Kyiv, right? This has become so developed. It was even part of the tariff framework with the EU, where the EU said it's going to invest $600 billion in the US. That investment means buying American defense products, right? The Russians would like to push that back. Are they able to get that cut off? J.D. Vance, interestingly, who has been hostile to European and Ukrainian security, I think his position's changing. After he met with the UK and thus with the Europeans over the weekend, he came back, he spoke to Fox TV yesterday, and he said, okay, we're not giving away, we're not giving money to Ukraine, we're not giving that, that standard Trump line. But what he didn't say is, we're not going to provide military assistance by selling it. He didn't row back on that. That's in advance. Now, on the second thing that I think we're looking for going forward is, do the Russians continue with those missile and drone strikes, right? Now, if they do, as they have done all throughout this year, I think they do misjudge Trump and they misjudge the U.S. Congress for sure. And I think then the pressure for the toughened sanctions comes back into play. In other words, they may buy themselves a small window of time, but as soon as they go back on the aerial offensive against Ukraine civilians, that window closes again because Congress comes back into session in September next month. And when you've got 85 of 100 senators who've signed on to that sanctions bill, they parked that while they waited for Trump to see if his threat of secondary tariffs will go through. If he doesn't follow through, I think they finally will in Congress, and they'll force Trump's hand.
Well, what's interesting about the sanctions bill and Trump sanctions, because they're obviously two separate things, as you've pointed out, Scott. What is interesting is that, if they're trying to stall time by having this meeting because they don't want these secondary sanctions, it's quite amusing in the fact that Russia, the Kremlin, came out and basically said that they are immune to secondary sanctions, that they've lived the last few years with these Western sanctions and they've survived without them. So it just makes me think, wow, your facade, we've seen through your facade, these are clearly affecting you and they will impact you greatly if they're implemented.
Yeah, okay, well, let's take this in two parts. First of all, Russian economy, not going to collapse. I know all the people who like to come in on those fine YouTube comments go, you've been predicting the collapse for 3 years. No. What has happened is that Russia has running this overheated economy, as they have done for 41 and a half months, to prosecute the war. And you can do that for a time. But they are now at the point where they have inflation going up, but at the same time, they've got the possibility of a recession. And that's the worst of both worlds that you have, right? Because if you want to stave off a recession, you lower your interest rates. But if you lower your interest rates, you could spike inflation. There's a battle going on between the Russian central bank and the finance ministry right now over this. Russian GDP is flatlining now. It is now close to zero in terms of growth. It had been growing at about 4% over the last few years. The ruble is under a great deal of pressure now because it's actually too strong against other currencies, which means it's difficult for Russia to carry out exports. But most importantly, their oil revenues are suffering big time now. It took a while for this to happen, but Russia's oil revenues have dropped significantly, and the government budget deficit has jumped by about 30% in the last few months, right? Now, the other element of this, though, however, is secondary sanctions. And you know who's not immune from secondary sanctions? All right, the Chinese may get away with this because they're in talks with the Americans about Trump's tariff nonsense, yada, yada, yada. But the Indians would get hard by secondary sanctions. And the U.S. and India are already at loggerheads right now because Trump's decided he wanted to punish India anyway, for reasons I can get into. So last week, remember, before the meeting in Alaska was announced, he said, 25% sanctions on India. No, wait, 50%. 50% on India for buying Russian oil. Now, that's, the Indians, they can ride out some tariffs, but they can't ride out 50% tariffs. So what are they already doing? Quietly, they won't publicly admit to it. They are suspending some oil supplies from Russia. There are 4 Russian tankers that have been parked off the coast of India that weren't supplying oil. So no, the sanctions do have an effect. They don't collapse the Russian economy, but they constrain Russia's abilities.
And strain just any sort of extra money that he would be funneling into the war. But Scott, I want to ask you about the location of the meeting. Now, it will again take place this Friday, August 15. We're not quite sure exactly what time yet, but it is in Alaska on American soil. Now, of course, we know that Alaska is somewhat significant to the Russians, but I want to ask you, we thought that this would take place in Saudi. We thought it would take place with mediation of the Crown Prince, and now it is in America. How significant do you think this is? And is it risky or is it a power move to have Vladimir Putin in the US?
It's theater. It's not risky because I don't think Russia's going to dare invade Alaska.
Well, risky for Putin, Scott. Risky for Putin.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that that Ukrainian saboteurs are going to get into Alaska and try to bump off Vlad. No, it's all theater, and now it's the fun part of Russia's invasion and death and destruction, which is why do they choose this country? Which completely screws it up for you and me because we were going to talk Friday to debrief.
We're the ones that we suffer, though.
And we suffer because Alaska's 9 hours behind us, right? So, for those who don't know, in 1867, I believe it is, just after the U.S. Civil War, and America's like, oh, how can we get over the fact we've been fighting each other? They look at this area called Alaska, and the Secretary of State, called William Seward, says, we'll buy it off the Russians. That was Russian territory. And Russia, which has run into its own problems under the Russian royal family and is kind of like trying to catch up with the rest of Europe but doesn't have the money to do it, they sell it cheap, right? Now, at the time, most Americans didn't want Alaska. It was called Seward's Folly. But guess what? It has lots of minerals. It has lots of stuff that's really, really valuable. So it pays off in the end. But the upshot of this is that Trump can say the meeting's being held in the U.S., but state TV in Russia, following the guidance of the Kremlin, say this is being held in Russian America. This was our territory, right? And we're going back to it. And maybe Donald Trump will give it back to us, right? And they have actually used that line. And I think they were joking, but I'm not sure. They said, Trump might give us Alaska. So it's all for the theater of it. There was one meeting between the Biden folks in China up in Anchorage back in 2021. And if this might foreshadow what happens on Friday, it was a disaster. It went absolutely about as badly wrong as it could. I think, and this emphasizes why I think this is theater and not substance. If you were really talking substance in terms of hammering out a deal, you probably do set it up into, possibly Turkey, possibly some other country where Vladimir Putin will not get arrested because, remember, there's a warrant out for him by the International Criminal Court over deporting Ukrainian children. So you probably have it in the Gulf or in Turkey. Here, you put it into Alaska for the cameras. Everybody does the chit-chat. But no, it's not the deal to end all deals.
Well, we'll be watching that, Scott. We've got a few days left, and I'm sure you'll be back on the program before Friday or Saturday. So, Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
All right. Thank you, Maddie. Stay safe, stay sane.